bailing on a marriage because a woman at the office pays more attention to you than your wife, or coffee with a man turns into dinner because unlike your husband, he listens to you and he makes you laugh, those are not reasons to quit your marriage. Those are reasons to get help for your marriage. In marriage, we make vows and promises. If you're married in the room or online and you're watching, you probably said something like this on your wedding day. I take you to be my wife or my husband, to have and to hold, for better or for worse, for richer or poor, in sickness and health, to cherish and love till the death do we part. But then how many times do people break those vows when intimacy is lacking? Or when tragedy strikes in the marriage, maybe a loved one dies or the loss of a child. When there's sky-high debt and there's no money to pay it. When illness comes or unhealthy habits show up. I find myself constantly giving this caveat because it's true on one end. There's certain situations where one person must leave the marriage. Life-threatening situations, situations of abuse and neglect. There are those situations where someone needs to opt out. They need to leave the marriage. But bailing on a marriage because a woman at the office pays more attention to you than your wife, or coffee with a man turns into dinner because unlike your husband, he listens to you and he makes you laugh, those are not reasons to quit your marriage. Those are reasons to get help for your marriage. But in relation to contracts and covenants, all contracts have an end date. But a covenant has no end date because relationships can't be easily discarded. This is why divorce is so painful. It is the ripping and tearing apart of a relationship. Someone described divorce to me this way. They said it was as if my arm was being torn off of my body. When the marriage covenant is broken, it tears the relational fabric that once held two people together. And it's not easily done. And it's not easy to walk away from. Now, it's important to note that our marriages are a depiction of our faithfulness to God. And they either represent our love for Jesus or they don't. When we say I do in marriage, we are participating in the covenant with God. When we say I do in our marriages, we are committing to do something. And that something is to be faithful to God and to be faithful to our husbands or wives. That's our end of the bargain. Because when we're joined together in marriage, we are joined together with God. When challenged on divorce, whether it was lawful or not, Jesus replies saying this in Matthew 19. He says, haven't you read the scriptures? They record that from the beginning, God made them male and female. And he said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife. And the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two, but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. And then the religious leaders trying to trap him, they respond with this. Why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? And Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. Jesus restates God's picture of marriage that we heard in Genesis 1, verses 27 and 28. In other words, there is no new teaching on marriage from Jesus. But he does say that Moses permitted divorce because husbands were leaving their wives for ridiculous reasons. So Moses commands husbands to give a certificate of divorce. At the same time, Romans were operating under another law, the Lex Julia. It was given by Augustus, and his daughter's name was Julia. And it was a law that encouraged marriage in order to increase the Roman population. The Lex Julia, it penalized celibacy and childlessness while also regulating marriage and divorce. And for nearly 500 years, up until the year 535 AD, there were very few Roman divorces. But at the same time, there were many, many, many unfulfilled and unfaithful marriages. A lot like today. Because people then and people now have lost sight of why they entered into marriage in the first place. And the point is this. Whether it was commanding husbands to issue certificates of divorce or passing legislation making divorce nearly impossible to achieve, none of it was done in love. What Jesus wants us to understand is this: don't treat marriage, which is so sacred and so special, with contempt and with carelessness. Marriage is a covenant. It is not bound by a piece of paper or judicial legislation. It is a binding agreement that God enters into with those who marry.